this King's Politics event. We are delighted to be joined by Lord Sumption. He is one of the most prominent individuals in the legal sphere, having defended multiple cases as a barrister, multiple cases for Her Majesty's government, and Roman Abramovich. He was also elected to the Supreme Court, uniquely directly as a barrister. And we'll be discussing the main contents of this event will be pertaining to lockdown, and as Lord Sumption is one of the most prominent lockdown skeptics. And beginning this talk will be a 10-minute speech by Lord Sumption. So can we put our hands together for Lord Sumption, please?
Good evening. Over the past 2 years, I have made a large number of enemies, as well as some quite firm friends, by criticizing the response to COVID-19 by various governments, including our own. Let me start with a number of negatives. I am not opposed to all non-pharmaceutical interventions to control infectious disease. I do not feel particularly strongly about masks or reasonable physical distancing. I'm not opposed to vaccines, although I certainly don't believe that they should be made compulsory, either directly or indirectly. I don't believe that either liberty or the preservation of human life are absolute values prevailing over all other considerations, although I accept that they are both important values. In public policy, there are no absolute values. There are only pluses and minuses. My objection is really to mass coercion and is focused principally on lockdowns. I oppose them for essentially 3 reasons. First, they are not significantly more effective than sensible voluntary precautions, which I think that people would take anyway if they were vulnerable and needed to. Secondly, lockdowns have catastrophic collateral consequences, social, economic, educational, and psychological. Thirdly, they depend on a view of the relations between the state and the citizen, which I reject because it treats human beings as mere instruments of collective policy. Now, the main point of this evening's session is the Q&A, so I shall say a very brief word about each of those points. First, how effective are they? Lockdowns would certainly be effective if they were total, permanent, and global. Those things are not possible, not least because somebody has to be responsible for sustaining basic services like food distribution and so on. Without being total, permanent, and global, the effect of lockdowns is simply to push infections and mortality into the period after they are lifted. That is why we are still grappling with COVID-19 after 2 years, 2 lengthy lockdowns, and in some countries after 3. It's also why, over the medium term, international comparisons show no correlation at all between lockdown and mortality. The defenders of lockdowns have never been prepared to confront the case of Sweden, a country which went against the trend. It's a country with urban densities broadly comparable to our own, which has had results in terms of both infection and mortality very close to the European average and a great deal better than ours, in spite of having had no lockdown and only minimal coercive measures. Secondly, the collateral consequences. These are mainly the result of the indiscriminate character of lockdowns. COVID-19 is, in one respect, a great deal easier to deal with than some other pathogens like the one that caused Spanish flu a century ago, because COVID-19 is relatively selective. It impacts the old and those with a number of identifiable vulnerabilities and comorbidities. The mortality in other categories has been relatively small. The average age at which people die of COVID-19 in this country is 82.4, which is comparable to the age at which they die of anything else. The equivalent figure in the United States is 78. It would therefore have been more sensible for those in vulnerable categories to isolate themselves for their own protection, and for the government to encourage but not compel them to do it. This was in fact the policy urged by SAGE right up to the announcement of the first lockdown. It was the basis of UK pandemic planning ever since the National Risk Register first identified a major pandemic as top of the risk register on its first publication in 2008. It was also the basis of pandemic planning in Germany and in every European country which had a pandemic plan. Instead, the government spent several times the monthly cost of the NHS on paying people not to work who were in younger, healthier groups at minimal risk of getting seriously ill or dying. The collateral consequences have been very serious. They include serious effects on mortality from conditions other than COVID-19, notably cancer, ischemic heart disease, and dementia. The estimated death toll from undiagnosed or untreated cancer cases alone has been put at about 30,000 in the UK. Similar prognoses have been made in other European countries, notably Spain and Italy. The collateral consequences continue with the retarding of education, which the brightest pupils will no doubt make good in due course, but which will do permanent damage to the life prospects of others who are less able. It includes the worst economic shock for 300 years, involving the destruction of many healthy businesses, some of which will never reopen. Now, these are not consequences of COVID-19. They are all consequences of the measures taken to contain it. They are a man-made disaster. If this is the price of the modest measure of additional security which lockdowns may afford, then it is very much too high. Now, of course, public health matters, but it is not the only thing that matters. Finally, there is the moral factor. We can only live together in society if we allow a large measure of autonomy to each other. We get on with each other because we are allowed to do our own thing. Lockdowns deprive us of our autonomy in a particularly critical respect. They deprive us of the right to make our own risk assessments in the light of our own vulnerabilities and those of the people around us. They do this by preventing us from interacting with other human beings, whether the particular risks justify it or not. Now, interaction with other human beings is not simply an enjoyable leisure activity. It is absolutely fundamental to our existence as social animals and to our life as a community. It is a basic condition of most human creativity. It is necessary for our mental well-being and our happiness. It is, in short, a large part of what life is about. Lockdowns are therefore a sustained assault on an important aspect of our humanity. All liberty carries risks, mostly risks to ourselves, but sometimes risks to other people. The basic question that we have to ask ourselves is, whose responsibility should it be to limit the ordinary risks inseparable from social existence? Should it be the responsibility of each one of us, or should it be the state's? We all have a personal responsibility to look after our own safety. If we are vulnerable, we have a personal responsibility to shelter ourselves. Whether we are vulnerable or not, we have a personal responsibility to limit, as far as we can, the risks which the ordinary incidents of life pose to our neighbours. But liberty and safety are therefore perfectly compatible with each other. They are only in conflict if we try to shuffle off our personal responsibilities onto the state. The reason for that is that the state has only one possible response, which is coercion. If we make the state responsible for ensuring that nothing goes wrong, then it will coerce us in order to ensure that nothing can go wrong. And because the risks of things going wrong are inseparable from life itself, that will inevitably involve suppressing some part of life itself. When the state resorts to coercion, it has to adopt indiscriminate measures like lockdowns because selective measures are simply too difficult to apply. Michael Gove made a more significant point than I suspect he realized when, in an article in the Times a year ago, he put that forward as the main justification for indiscriminate measures by suggesting that anything more discriminating would have been too difficult for the police to enforce. So coercion, in effect, becomes its own justification. The defining characteristics of the totalitarian state is that it treats human beings as mere instruments of state policy. That is what most European governments have done, including ours. Perhaps the most striking illustration of this in this country has been the argument that we have to lock people down in order not to overwhelm the NHS. The NHS is unfortunately very frequently overwhelmed, even in years when there is no COVID-19. It has been in danger of being overwhelmed once, last winter. That is because successive governments have run down the NHS, leaving us with by far the lowest acute bed capacity per 100,000 of population in the whole of Europe. Our acute bed capacity is comparable to that of many countries of the Third World. I don't, for my part, accept that because the state provides us with a health service which is inadequate, it is entitled to coerce us so that we will not get ill. This is what seems to me to be an extreme example of the instrumentalization of human beings. Ultimately, we only have to reflect on the history of the past 2 years and look around us now to see that once an epidemic disease becomes endemic, as this one has been since the spring of 2020, we have to live with it. We are discovering now that even vaccines, valuable as they are, can do no more than palliate the consequences. They will not eliminate the disease. The government of this country has privately come to recognize this. I think that it is a very great pity that they did not recognize it at the outset, but instead embarked on a brutally coercive policy with no preparation, no preliminary research, and no real thought for the wider consequences. Whatever one may think about the clinical value of the measures which they took, nobody can possibly admire the way in which those decisions were made. It seems to me to be a basic principle of government that you should not take measures which radically affect people without knowing what the consequence is likely to be. Yet that was what our own government and most governments in Europe did. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech, Lord Sumption. I think, as a first question, I just wanted to ask, how has it been being considered quite a controversial figure in our discourse about the pandemic?
Sorry?
Quite a controversial figure.
Why have I been controversial? I think a majority, a very large majority of the population of this country, certainly at the outset, strongly supported this policy. They strongly supported it because they were afraid. And it is unfortunately one of the lessons of history that fear induces people to surrender basic freedoms to an authoritarian government. People who swim against the tide have never been popular, and I'm no exception.
Does this controversy that sort of surrounds lockdown skepticism reflect a change in national psychology, as you would describe yourself as a small liberal, which I guess previously would not be seen as controversial? Do you think the lockdown has sort of changed the
Yes, I
entire
think it
dynamic?
has. You can measure this by comparing the reaction to earlier pandemics. Large-scale pandemics are not new. I mean, COVID-19 is at the more serious end of the scale, but the first major international pandemic since the age of mass communications was probably the Russian flu pandemic of 1889. That was less serious than COVID-19, although it is chemically, I believe, very similar. Spanish flu, which is in some respects different, was a great deal more mortal. It's estimated to have killed about 200,000 people in this country. The twin outbreaks of what seemed to have been the same pathogen of Hong Kong flu in 1968 and 10 years before that, avian flu in 1957, they had comparable case mortality rates, although probably lower levels of infection. Now, COVID-19 is a serious illness, but it's well within the broad range of epidemic diseases with which human beings have always had to cope from time to time, roughly once every 33 years on average. It is a great deal milder than many other diseases which we have had to cope with for much longer. Bubonic plague, cholera, tuberculosis were all very much more serious in their time. MERS and SARS would have been if they had hit Europe, as they did much of the Middle East and parts of the Far East. In none of the earlier epidemics did people react in this way. Indeed, a deliberate decision was taken by most governments in 1957 and 1968 not to cause alarm by introducing measures, even by way of advice. The government was not criticised for that at the time. At the height of the 1968 epidemic, the newspapers were mainly full of news about the Sputnik. There obviously has been a very significant change. The change is not in the nature of the epidemic diseases to which we are subject, which are relatively familiar over a long period of time. The change is actually in ourselves. We demand a level of security which is in many ways unrealistic. We are less inclined to take the risks which we should recognise are associated with life as a human community.
So you talked about sort of concepts of fear and the fact that a large amount of people are sort of willing to abide by these rules. Do you see the fact that individuals are willing to give up their liberty to the state in this situation as concerning? And in regards to, say, political philosophy, how do you see this in relation to, say, some of the ideas of Thomas Hobbes?
Well, Thomas Hobbes had a view of the state which most people would regard, I suspect, as repellent. His view was that human beings surrender their liberties, all their liberties, absolutely unconditionally and irreversibly to the state in return for security. He was an apologist for absolute government. Now, although we find his conclusion repellent, he did put his finger on a very significant feature of human nature. Virtually every tyranny that has ever existed has depended on fear of something, fear of an external enemy, fear of an internal enemy, in this case, fear of a disease. This is a very ancient and consistent aspect of human history. And it seems to me that while we do reject his conclusion, we have effectively been living according to his prescriptions for the last 2 years. That is a change.
You see liberty as not an absolute value, but an important one. It seems like a lot of the medical community would see the situation as justifying restrictions and lockdown.
Well, that's part of the problem. It is the medical community, part of it. Certainly the most vocal part of it. The problem is that it's not just a medical issue. It is partly a medical issue, certainly, but it's also a social issue, a psychological issue, an educational issue, an economic issue. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is not, is this a good thing, other things being equal, but is it a good thing as conditions actually are? you always have to ask yourself the question, is it worth it? And medics are no more qualified to answer that question than any of us in this room. It's essentially a value judgment about what price you are prepared to pay in economic and other terms for a measure of security. That depends partly on how great the threat is, but mainly on the value that you attach to what makes life worth living. Sorry, this is not COVID. Yes.
So I think following on to that, if liberty is an important value but not an absolute one, there's situations where the state can impose upon liberty. So
yes.
What I wanted to ask is, what sort of risk would justify the state intruding on the lives of healthy individuals?
Well, in areas other than public health, it did so, I think, justifiably in both of the last world wars. In the domain of public health, you can't put a precise calculation on it, but I would accept, for instance, that if we were talking about bubonic plague with a case mortality rate of about 80%, if we were talking about a smallpox outbreak from a laboratory with a case mortality rate of around 50%, if we were talking about Ebola, case mortality rate about 30%, the argument for lockdowns would be a great deal stronger. But equally, the likelihood that people would shelter themselves on a larger scale is also much greater. What the Swedish experiment has shown is that if you put the facts before people neutrally, they have enough sense of self-preservation to be able to look after themselves. They will isolate themselves if they need to. But the fact is that most people in this country have not needed to, because most people are not over 70 and do not suffer from the established comorbidities that are liable to lead to serious illness.
You have described these laws as despotic. I was wondering, is there a moral obligation to disobey laws which are of this nature?
No, there's not a moral obligation to do so. It's a matter of personal choice. I would say that there was a moral right to obey laws. I think you've got to distinguish between the moral and legal consequences of disobeying them. If you disobey a law, you cannot complain if you are punished with whatever the law prescribes as the fine, imprisonment, or whatever. But ultimately, whether we are prepared to take that risk, whether we do it for reasons of principle or convenience, is a matter for our own consciences. Morally speaking, the moral plane seems to me to be completely independent of the legal obligation.
One of your criticisms of locking down was a possibility of reversion, and you noted that
Possibility of
reverting to measures in the future, which are similar.
I see. Yes.
And you, I believe you say that we tend to operate by convention rather than law. Do you, as the pandemic recedes and as lockdowns ease, do you still have this fear?
Yes, because when liberal societies fail, it's usually for cultural reasons and not institutional ones. We have an elaborate framework of institutions and laws which are characteristic of most democracies. When democracies fail, it's not usually because the institutional framework breaks down. It's usually because to make them work, to make any liberal or democratic society work, you need a culture which wants it to work. You need a measure of restraint. You need to recognize that there are things which the state is physically capable of doing and constitutionally capable of doing, but which it nevertheless should not do. Once you break those conventions, the spell has gone. It can be done again. And we have plenty of experience of this, not in the public health field, but wartime regulations, which imposed a really very high degree of enforceable social control on the population of this country, remained in force for years and years after the end of the Second World War. Food rationing remained in being until 1952. Obligations to carry identity cards, which were introduced in order to protect us from spies and fifth columnists in 1940, remained in force until the mid-50s. Some of the more draconian powers of requisition were still in force in the 1990s, when Richard Scott's Matrix Churchill report drew attention to the anomaly. Most of the emergency powers were subject to a sunset clause, which provided, these were in regulations and legislation passed on the 3rd of September 1939, the first day of the war. They provided that the laws or regulations in question should expire as soon as His Majesty made an order in council declaring that the present emergency, no prizes for guessing what that was, had ended. The governments of the day, of both political complexions, got round this by simply refraining from putting any such order in council before His or Her Majesty, so that requisition powers, for example, were being exercised during the Falklands War on the basis that the Second World War had never come to an end. Now, I just cite this as one illustration of the fact that governments do not readily give up powers that they've got, even if they are in principle willing to do so. The cultural change of the kind that we've witnessed in relation to public health in the last 2 years indicates that they probably don't need to, because public opinion will tolerate this. And I think a cultural change of the magnitude that we have seen is very much more difficult to reverse than an institutional one.
Do you believe in the long term, as we look back on this pandemic, people will see that the costs outweigh the benefits?
I think they probably will, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it.
And I think this will be a final question before I go to the audience, which I imagine have a lot of questions. You're also a prominent historian. How do you think those historians of the future will look back on this period? Well, and your opinion?
I mean, I came to this subject as a historian. It seems to me that the response to the pandemic was historically unprecedented, and some knowledge of the way in which human societies have been affected by disease over the last millennium is quite a useful thing. I'm sometimes asked what qualifications I have to opine at all on questions that involve, to some extent, questions of epidemiology. And my answer is that I have the same qualifications as the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health, namely, I can read and I can count. I have an additional qualification which they may not have, which is that I have some knowledge of the way that human societies have developed and the challenges that they have faced over some centuries.
Right, so we are going to go to audience questions. I think what we'll do this is, if you have a question, just put your hands up. And we'll start over here.
Hi, thank you very much. Thinking about what you're saying about liberty and authoritarianism, how would you assess the legacy of counter-terrorism measures over the last 20 years on liberty and authoritarianism, thinking about such measures like Schedule 7, secret courts, and the Prevent agenda? Of course, Max Hill, QC, who was independent reviewer of counter-terror legislation, said that we don't need counter-terror legislation because existing criminal law before 9/11 was enough. So I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I've got some sympathy with the view that he expressed. It has always been an offence to create explosions. It's always been an offence to kill people. The problem about bringing in these draconian further laws is that police forces and indeed ministers, when presented with powers, tend to use them 150%. I think that some of the examples that you have given are understandable, others are not. Some of the powers, the power, for example, to stop and search people more or less at random, is a power which has been seriously abused. One example is the power which is vested in the Home Secretary to declare particular geographical areas for a month at a time to be areas in which the police can do this. When David Blunkett was the Home Secretary, he made an order covering the whole of southeastern England for the maximum period he was allowed to, namely 28 days, and then continued it routinely at 28 days intervals thereafter. That, to my mind, was an abuse. Personally, I regard the prevent doctrine as one, useless, and two, oppressive. It requires people, on the basis of what may be extremely flimsy impressions, to report them with consequences that may be extremely serious for those individuals without affecting the risk at all. I think that the record of the Prevent programme in actually preventing anything is very poor indeed.
So, Lord Sumption, I remember when measures were introduced to combat believed people lying about travelling abroad, and there were penalties greater than that for sexual assault and possession of a firearm with criminal intent. And you wrote quite a strong piece, I remember, mentioning that no self-respecting judge would enforce such laws. So do you believe that there is a point at which laws get so ridiculous the judiciary can avoid enforcing?
Well, that's not exactly what I said. What I said was that if you had a maximum sentence of 10 years, it didn't follow that judges would pass such a sentence. They have a discretion, unless you also have a minimum sentence, and that's something that even Matt Hancock didn't propose. But I mean, the whole of this issue was a complete red herring, because Matt Hancock announced that there would be 10-year sentences, maximum sentences, for lying on your locator form, pretending that you hadn't been to Portugal or Brazil, which I think were then regarded as the red-hot areas. But when the regulations turned up, they contained no such provision, for the very good reason that sentences of that gravity are not within the powers under the Public Health Act. It turned out that what he was talking about was the Forgery Act, which has a maximum sentence of 10 years. And Matt Hancock was suggesting that if you put in a lie in your locator form, that made it a forgery. This is such a basic fallacy. There is a difference between a document that is untrue and a document that is not what it purports to be, because it isn't by the person who appears to have signed it. So the whole thing was a ridiculous storm in a teacup. But I thought that it said something about Matt Hancock's sense of proportion, that he should have seriously suggested in the House of Commons and elsewhere that pretending not to have been to Portugal was an offence on a par, if not more serious, than many forms of serious sexual assault or fraud.
Let's go to the guy.
Hi, thank you very much. A question about the traffic light system. So I was flying from Montenegro and Albania at some point. Red was the red light. And I just felt so discriminated against when compared to, like, you know, France or Germany, and then you'd have like Latvia and Lithuania in the middle. And do you feel like the government didn't sort of base the traffic light system on the biological and epidemiological basis, but on the discriminatory sort of politics?
Well, my objections to quarantine rules on travelling into the country are not as strong as my objections to lockdowns. And quarantine is, of course, a very ancient form of anti-epidemic procedure. It's first mentioned in the Old Testament in the book of Deuteronomy. So it's been around for a long time. So I'm not going to suggest that this is invariably a bad thing. I think that what you're complaining about with some justification is the rather arbitrary way in which it was handled. In particular, there was one point at which France was put in a higher category of risk. They invented a sort of halfway house between amber and red, a sort of platform 8 3/4, which at a time, because of the prevalence, it was suggested, of a particular variant of COVID in France, which was much more prevalent in Spain, which was not on the list. So there are provisions of these regulations that are extremely difficult to rationalize. I entirely agree. On the whole, the surveys that have been carried out, and there have been quite a number of them, have suggested that the impact of all quarantine regulations, even those from red list countries, has been surprisingly small. The number of people who are required to quarantine from red list countries, and they are much more closely supervised because they have to go to government hospitals, who subsequently test positive for COVID, has been ridiculously small, and in fact not much greater than the number of people who test positive after visiting amber or green list countries. The whole thing has not been a triumph of science, I regret to say.
I wanted to ask, what do you think that we can learn from this? Do you think that because the executive jumped in and made a decision with no research or forethought, that we might need more executive accountability or controls on them?
Well, yes, we certainly need that. COVID was extremely strange because of the complete absence of any kind of contingency planning for a lockdown. It was regarded as unnecessary and unthinkable. It's a striking fact that 3 weeks before Italy announced the first European lockdown towards the end of February 2020, the European Centre for Disease Control published a review of the pandemic planning of all 28 members of the EU, including at that time us, because we were in the transitional phase of moving out of it. The striking thing is that all of these national pandemic plans described the range of measures which in sufficiently dire circumstances they might be induced to apply. Not one country in the 28, not one, suggested that a lockdown was even on the agenda. That is why there was no preparation. The decision to impose one was essentially political, and it was imposed because people were panicking and because the fact that it had already happened in Italy, Spain and France gave the government political cover. But it was never something that they were advised to do, even by the arch proponents of lockdowns like Professor Ferguson. Now, there is a lesson to be learned from that, but the real lesson is that we are never going to get out of this kind of problem as long as we are not prepared to live with certain risks. So long as we are obsessively frightened about risk and unwilling to accept things that are basic to fragile human beings, then governments will have cover to do that kind of thing. So what is actually required is not so much a change in the ways that governments behave. They've always enjoyed exercising as much power as they can get. What we actually need is a change in the way that we behave.
Sumption, you talked about how there has been a lot of societal fear around COVID-19. Do you think that the role of the media in stirring this up has been significant? And if so, do you think there are any restrictions that could or should be placed on this to prevent it occurring in the future?
Yes, I think that the media were responsible by their relentless focus on the most negative aspects of the situation, and that applies particularly to the social media, but also to many of the mainstream media. Of course, the media were not monolithic. There were people on the broadcast media who took a different view and who got a platform. There were newspapers that took a different view. To my mind, the media have basically reflected public fears. They have amplified them to some extent, but the fears had to be there in the first place for it to have that effect. I don't think that it's reasonable to demand censorship as a way of dealing with this problem, because it is basically simply an amplification of a sentiment that's in us already. What I find much more difficult to accept is the role of government in selectively presenting aspects of the pandemic in a way that were deliberately designed to induce and increase fear, because they believed at the outset that the public would not comply, or many of them wouldn't, and that it would be necessary to make them frightened in order to achieve that. There's a particularly remarkable minute of Sage dating from about a week before the lockdown was, first lockdown was announced, in which they say that not specifically in relation to lockdowns, but in relation to milder distancing measures, the problem about this is that quite a lot of people will feel that their state of health and their age make them relatively invulnerable to this. That was actually true. They were relatively invulnerable. Hardly anybody under 60 has actually died unless they had quite serious underlying conditions. But the Sage minute went on to say, well, in that case, we're going to have to frighten the daylights out of them. That's my paraphrase, not their words. These things are normally couched in the marmoreal language of the civil service. That minute told you a great deal about the governmental use of fear. And I regard that as sinister. It seems to me that the first duty of government is to be balanced and objective in its presentation of facts, because otherwise people are not going to take what it says seriously, and that you become more dependent than ever on coercion.
You've got upstairs.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the strategies of other nations in their controlling the pandemic, such as China, that had more stringent but shorter lasting lockdowns that seemed quite effective, and Hong Kong that had relatively minimal domestic measures but very strict 3 to 6 week quarantines on each country.
Well, China has the advantage of being a totalitarian state and has always taken the view that human beings are instruments of state policy. I think that we have, on the whole, prided ourselves in taking a different view about relations between the state and the citizen until relatively recently. Hong Kong is rather a special case. What they have done is Hong Kong is pretty well sealed off from the outside world if it wants to be. And they did not have lockdowns, but they had an extremely rigid quarantine rule, which has effectively put an end to all international travel in or out of Hong Kong. The level of international travel is extremely small. I know this because I go to Hong Kong about once a year. Because I go there as a judge, I get exempted. But the planes are not virtually empty at one stage. I don't think either of these countries have many lessons for us. What I think is very striking is that nobody suggested that such a thing was desirable or possible at any stage in Europe or in North America until it happened.
Let's go.
You spoke of the widespread support
Of the
widespread support for lockdowns.
Sorry, I didn't get the second word of the...
The support.
Oh, I see. Yes, yes, I did.
Do you think that this is something, this sort of propensity towards totalitarianism is something inherent in British politics, or do you think something's changed in the past couple of years?
Well, I don't think it's inherent in British politics as we've experienced it in the past. But it is the case that every despot in history has depended to some degree on fear in order to maintain his power. And this is very often, as it has been in this case, fear of a peril, the degree of which has been exaggerated by public authorities. But it's much more to do with the spontaneous fears of people at large. People will, this is the Hobbes point, people will voluntarily surrender their liberty if they are sufficiently frightened.
How would you assess Bolsonaro's response to the pandemic?
Well, Bolsonaro is mad. And I don't think that it's possible to draw any general conclusions from anything that a person like that says. I would say exactly the same of the last President of the United States. I mean, it's very unfortunate in the case of Trump. Nobody really pays much attention to Bolsonaro, but they have no choice but to pay some attention to Trump. One of the unfortunate things has been that because Trump disapproved of lockdowns, and Trump is, for perfectly good reasons, a widely hated figure across the world and certainly in the West, that has tended to discredit people who oppose lockdowns for altogether more carefully thought out reasons than Trump did. So he's done a great deal of damage to his own cause.
You spoke a lot about the problems which exist in government, perhaps their own nature, which led to the kind of authoritarian response that lots of the Western governments have had to COVID. Do you see any kind of remedy for the future which might not make this happen again?
Ultimately, the only remedy, in my view, is that we learn to live with high levels of risk. Because they're going to be with us, whether we like it or not. There will be other pandemics. There will be other disasters. Climate change is an obvious example, which people will get frightened of, and which will lead to highly authoritarian measures. I'm afraid the only cure for this is that we become a bit more robust.
Okay.
Do you think that Johnson had a spine to resist calls for a lockdown, or is it just a populist?
Well, the trouble about Boris Johnson is not a fool, but he is bone idle. And one of the problems is that if you don't study your dossiers in some detail, you have no way of standing up to people who are urging you to do this or that thing. You are basically buffeted to and fro by people with loud voices and some expertise. I spoke some months ago to a member of Macron's Élysée staff in France, who described to me the process which goes into his decision-making. Basically, he sees his experts once a week. The day before he clears his diary, he receives a great case full of scientific papers and a précis of the advice that the experts are going to give. And when they come in, he cross-examines them from knowledge. It's very hard to imagine any process remotely like that occurring in 10 Downing Street. I'm not an unqualified admirer of Macron, but I think that his treatment of this relatively complex, partly scientific issue is a great deal more serious and responsible than that which we have seen from our own Prime Minister. And it's one of the reasons why he has reversed course so often, that he just does not have the energy to get to the bottom of things so that he can devise a policy of his own, instead of being the shape of the last bottom that sat on him.
Do you think the sort of manipulation of messaging, which you mentioned, is part of laying the number of conspiracy theories that's perhaps around here?
The manipulation of what?
Like messaging by the government.
Oh, I see. No, I don't actually. I mean, I think there will always be conspiracy theorists. People like that sort of thing. It's a much more exciting story than the truth. I don't think governments they have manipulated information, but I don't think they've done it in a way to encourage conspiracy theories. I mean, I've never understood what Bill Gates is supposed to have done to create the current problem. Never.
Has the lack of parliamentary oversight facilitated Tory schemes?
Sorry, can you speak a bit louder?
Has the lack of parliamentary oversight during COVID facilitated Tory schemes?
Yes, it has. I think that it's extremely unfortunate that the government at a very early stage took a deliberate decision to use the Public Health Act as the vehicle for imposing these restrictions. I do not myself believe, although the Court of Appeal has taken a different view, that the Public Health Act was ever designed to deal with this. It was designed to give ministers some of the powers that magistrates enjoy to deal with infected premises and infected people. There is another act which undoubtedly doesn't empower the government to do whatever it's done, namely the Civil Contingencies Act. The reason why the government did not want to use the Civil Contingencies Act is that it requires a very high level of parliamentary supervision. Basically, you have to have the powers renewed by parliamentary vote at least every 30 days. Moreover, there are provisions which say that you can introduce regulations under the Civil Contingencies Act for periods of up to 7 days without parliamentary approval, but Parliament has to be recalled, whatever the circumstances, in order to approve them within 7 days. Now, I think that would have been a much more sensible regime. I can't suggest that Parliament would actually have made, if it had greater oversight, would have put an end to some of the more draconian rules, because we have a Conservative government with a Labour opposition. The Labour Party has always favoured a high degree of social control, and the parliamentary arithmetic means that they would always have got their regulations through, because the Labour Party's process has always been to take what the government is doing and double it. I think that's very unfortunate. I think that, ironically, if we'd had a Labour government, I have very little doubt that the Conservatives would have objected, on what I regard as perfectly rational grounds, to what it was doing.
Thank you. Considering that coronavirus poses the least risk to young people, but also the restrictions that pose the largest economic and social impact on them, why do you think they are so keen to support lockdowns?
Yes, I've often asked myself that question. It seems to me that I would do better to ask you what the answer is than to venture an answer myself. I think that young people are less sceptical of governmental power than perhaps they ought to be, in perhaps certain areas. I think that they have far too readily accepted the narrative which says that this is that it's necessary for people who are relatively invulnerable to be locked up in order to avoid infecting people who are much more vulnerable, instead of looking at it the other way around and sheltering the people who are highly vulnerable. But I do not know why there is the degree of support that there obviously is in your generation for acts which do them no good and a great deal of harm.
Hi, sorry. I look like Hong Kong, Western Australia, which is where I'm from, has practically shut itself down to the world. And vaccination rates there are quite low, which some people cite due to there being no fear because there's low cases and life has been relatively normal since the pandemic started. Do you think it's justified to ask a state like that to open up to the world again?
Well, the main reason why New Zealand and Australia have had very low levels of vaccination until recently, and they're still quite low in fact, is that they closed their borders at a very early stage. This is something that did a great deal of damage to those societies, and it seems to me that when you close your borders to your own citizens, you are doing something that is probably contrary to international law, but certainly unforgivable. But one consequence of that was that Australia had by far the most brutal regime of any Western country. It was absolutely extraordinary seeing videos of the police fighting people to the ground for not wearing masks, for example. The whole thing was extraordinarily disproportionate. But what it has meant is that the levels of immunity achieved in countries like New Zealand are very low, and they are paying a very high price for that just at the moment, precisely because sooner or later there is a reckoning. All of these measures merely defer infections and associated deaths, and the stricter they are, the greater the bounce back when they're lifted. So the dilemmas faced by countries like New Zealand is you can keep this in being for a while, but the penalty will have to be paid when sooner or later you can't sustain it any longer. And Jacinta Ardern has effectively admitted that the policy which has appeared to work at one stage is now having disastrous consequences.
Any further questions, anyone? I think we'll end the session. Can we have a round of applause for